Look at the ocean. Really look at it. What do you see? Waves rolling endlessly, blue horizons stretching toward infinity. The same primordial rhythm that's pulsed for millions of years. But what if I told you that beneath that familiar surface, something is changing? Right now, in this very moment, and it's happening faster than anything we thought possible. What if the ocean you're looking at today is already becoming something else? Something we don't quite have words for yet. Evolution, we've been taught, is a glacial process, unfolding across millions of years in increments too small for human eyes to perceive. But that textbook certainty is crumbling. The ocean is transforming before us, and the creatures within it are evolving not over eons, but within decades, within years, within the span of a human lifetime. Scientists have documented marine snails in the Gulf of Maine completely altering their shell thickness in response to invasive predators warming their way northward. A fundamental anatomical redesign happening in real time as ocean temperatures climb. In Sweden, researchers watched a population of sea snails evolve distinct physical traits in just 3 years after being reintroduced to their habitat, their shells reshaping to match the pounding waves of their new environment. 3 years, not 3 million. Baltic flounders split into 2 reproductively isolated species in roughly 7,000 years, the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, adapting their entire spawning behavior to survive in the strange brackish waters left behind by retreating glaciers. These aren't statistical anomalies or laboratory curiosities. They're harbingers of something unprecedented, evolution moving fast enough that we can watch it happen. But here's where it gets unsettling. These rapid transformations aren't occurring in isolation. They're symptoms of something larger, something that should make us profoundly uneasy. The ocean is being subjected to pressures unlike anything in its 4-billion-year history, and it's responding in ways that defy our comfortable assumptions about how nature works. Ocean acidification, warming waters, expanding dead zones, cascading extinctions. These aren't just environmental problems. They're evolutionary accelerants, pressure cookers forcing life to adapt or vanish at speeds that seem almost impossible. And when evolution moves this fast, when the rules of natural selection are rewritten by unprecedented environmental chaos, we lose our ability to predict what comes next. We're flying blind into an oceanic future that's being improvised, generation by generation, in the darkness below. Consider what this actually means. Evolution requires genetic variation and selection pressure, the raw material of change and the force that shapes it. Our oceans now have both in terrifying abundance. Pollution has created chemical gradients that didn't exist before. Temperature zones are shifting hundreds of kilometers. Oxygen-depleted dead zones are spreading like shadows across continental shelves. Each of these changes represents a new evolutionary gauntlet, and marine organisms are running it right now, discarding traits that no longer work and cobbling together new ones from whatever genetic lottery they inherited. Some species are discovering adaptations buried deep in their DNA, variants that were useless in the stable oceans of the past, but are suddenly advantageous in this new, hostile environment. Others are evolving entirely novel traits through mutation and selection happening at accelerated rates. The ocean has become an uncontrolled experiment in forced adaptation, and no one knows what the results will look like. What haunts me most isn't just that evolution is happening quickly. It's that we're catching glimpses of changes that seem almost alien. Coral reefs, those ancient architects of tropical seas, are showing signs of heat resistance emerging in certain populations. Genetic shifts allowing them to survive temperatures that would have bleached their ancestors into skeletal graveyards. But alongside these hopeful adaptations, we're seeing stranger things. Jellyfish blooms proliferating in warming, overfished waters, their populations exploding into gelatinous swarms that dominate where complex ecosystems once thrived. Bioluminescent organisms moving into new territories, their eerie glow appearing in places it was never seen before. Deep-sea creatures venturing into shallower waters as oxygen levels shift, bringing anatomies designed for crushing pressure into realms they never evolved to inhabit. Each discovery feels like opening a door into a room that shouldn't exist. And then there's the truly disturbing question: what about intelligence? Evolution doesn't just shape bodies, it shapes behaviors, nervous systems, cognitive abilities. Marine mammals and cephalopods already possess remarkable problem-solving skills, complex social structures, sophisticated communication. But these abilities evolved in stable environmental contexts over millions of years. What happens when those contexts collapse and rebuild within decades? When orcas must hunt in radically altered ecosystems, when octopuses must navigate dead zones and acidified waters, when dolphins face prey distributions that shift annually rather than over millennia. The selection pressure isn't just for physical traits anymore, it's for behavioral flexibility, for learning, for thinking in new ways. Could we be witnessing the early stages of cognitive evolution in marine species? Could the ocean's thinking creatures be getting smarter? The thought is both wondrous and deeply unsettling. None of this would be happening without us. Human activity has become the dominant evolutionary force on this planet, and nowhere is that more visible than in the ocean. We've changed the chemistry of seawater, altered its temperature, restructured its ecosystems, and created selection pressures that never existed in Earth's entire history. We are, quite literally, driving evolution not through intentional breeding like domestication, but through massive, uncontrolled environmental disruption. And unlike terrestrial systems where we can at least observe the changes unfolding in forests and fields, the ocean hides its transformations beneath kilometers of dark water. Most of the evolutionary innovation happening right now is occurring in places we rarely visit, in depths we can't easily study, among organisms we've never catalogued. We're reshaping life itself, and we can't even see most of what we're creating. So when you look at the ocean now, at that familiar blue expanse, that eternal rhythm of waves, know that you're looking at a lie. Not the ocean itself, but our perception of it as unchanging, as constant, as safely predictable. Beneath that surface, in the crushing darkness and the sun-dappled shallows alike, life is scrambling, adapting, evolving at speeds that should be impossible. Shells are thickening, spawning behaviors are shifting, heat tolerance is emerging, anatomies are being redesigned, and we're only seeing the beginning, the first tremors of a transformation that will unfold across the next century. The ocean is still evolving, just as it always has. But now it's evolving fast enough that we can watch. Fast enough that we'll live to see what it becomes. And that should terrify us, because we have absolutely no idea what's coming next. Welcome to the age of rapid evolution. Welcome to the ocean that evolution forgot to slow down. Imagine placing a living creature into acid and watching what happens. The shell begins to dissolve, eaten away molecule by molecule. The skeleton weakens, unable to maintain its structure. Growth slows, then stops. Now imagine this isn't a laboratory experiment. It's happening right now across every ocean on Earth, to billions of organisms simultaneously. This is ocean acidification, and it's transforming the chemistry of seawater faster than at any point in the last 2 million years. Since the Industrial Revolution, the ocean has absorbed roughly a third of all the carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere, and that seemingly generous act of planetary buffering comes with a terrible price. The ocean's pH has dropped by about 25%, making seawater more acidic than it has been for millions of years. And this chemical shift isn't just a number on a scientific instrument. It's rewriting the rules of survival for everything that lives beneath the waves. But here's what makes acidification so insidious, so quietly horrifying. It's not killing organisms outright. Instead, it's making life incrementally harder, pushing species to the edge of their physiological limits and forcing them to adapt or perish. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it creates carbonic acid, which breaks apart into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. Those extra hydrogen ions bind with carbonate ions that marine organisms desperately need to build their shells and skeletons, essentially stealing the raw materials of survival. Corals, mollusks, sea urchins, oysters, countless species of plankton. All of them construct their bodies from calcium carbonate, and all of them are now operating in an ocean that's actively working against them. It's like trying to build a house while someone continuously removes bricks from your supply pile. You can still build, but it requires more energy, more time, more effort, and the structure you create is weaker, more fragile, more vulnerable to collapse. The numbers are staggering when you look at the research. Meta-analyses synthesizing hundreds of studies reveal that ocean acidification reduces survival, calcification, growth, development, and abundance across virtually all marine life when considered together. Survival rates drop by 27%. Calcification, the ability to build shells and skeletons, decreases by the same amount. Growth slows by 11 to 19%. These aren't abstract statistics. They represent real organisms struggling to exist in water that has become chemically hostile. Corals show some of the most dramatic impacts, with calcification rates plummeting by up to 39% in acidified conditions. Mollusk larvae, those tiny vulnerable specks of life drifting in the plankton, experience devastated development rates. Oyster larvae in the Pacific Northwest are dying en masse because their shells dissolve faster than they can form them in their critical first 48 hours of life. Half of all coral coverage has vanished since the 1950s. Acidification working alongside warming and pollution to dismantle reefs that took millennia to build. Yet this is where the pressure cooker effect begins to reveal itself in all its terrible complexity. Because while acidification is devastating many species, it's also creating the most intense selection pressure imaginable. A chemical gauntlet that sorts the survivors from the doomed with brutal efficiency. Not every individual within a species responds identically to acidification. Some oysters, some corals, some urchins possess genetic variants that confer slightly better tolerance to lower pH. In normal times, these variants might offer no particular advantage. But in an acidifying ocean, they become the difference between survival and extinction. The organisms that can maintain calcification despite the acid, that can repair dissolving shells, that can allocate energy more efficiently under stress. These are the ones that survive to reproduce, passing their advantageous genes to the next generation. Evolution doesn't care about individuals. It operates on populations, and acidification is performing the cruelest kind of natural selection on a planetary scale. And the pressure isn't just acidification alone. It's acidification combined with rising temperatures, expanding dead zones, pollution, overfishing, and habitat destruction. Each stressor amplifies the others in ways that create exponential challenges. Studies show that when organisms face acidification and warming simultaneously, their tolerance collapses far more dramatically than either stressor would cause alone. Temperature increases metabolic rates, demanding more energy precisely when acidification is making it harder to grow and maintain basic structures. Oxygen depletion forces organisms into smaller habitable zones where acidification may be even more severe. It's not a single pressure. It's a cascade of overlapping catastrophes, each one tightening the evolutionary vice. The ocean has become a crucible where only the most adaptable, the most resilient, the most physiologically flexible organisms can persist. And that crucible is running at temperatures and chemical conditions unlike anything in recent geological history. But here's the twist that should both terrify and fascinate us. Some organisms are responding. Not all species are collapsing under acidification. Some are adapting, evolving, finding ways to survive in water that should be lethal. Certain populations of corals are showing enhanced heat and acid tolerance, genetic shifts emerging within decades that allow them to calcify in conditions that would have killed their ancestors. Some sea urchins produce larvae that develop normally even in highly acidified water, suggesting rapid selection for acid-resistant genotypes. There are even species, like certain algae and seagrasses, that might actually benefit from higher carbon dioxide levels, growing faster and more vigorously in acidified oceans. Evolution experiments with calcifying algae show that after thousands of generations, these microscopic organisms develop improved fitness in acidic conditions, though they never fully recover their original growth rates. The adaptation has limits, yes, but it's happening. Life is finding ways, however costly, however incomplete, to persist in this new chemical reality. What emerges from this pressure cooker isn't the ocean we knew. It's something fundamentally different, an ecosystem being restructured from the bottom up. When calcifying organisms struggle, the species that depend on them as food or habitat struggle too. When coral reefs erode faster than they can rebuild, projected to occur globally by 2080, entire communities of fish and invertebrates lose their homes. Food webs collapse and reassemble with different players. Studies of natural carbon dioxide seeps, places where volcanic activity has been acidifying water for centuries, show us glimpses of this future. Complex branching corals replaced by massive boulder forms, diverse reef systems giving way to algae-covered rubble, ecosystems simplified and stripped of their biodiversity. But among the ruins, certain species thrive, opportunistic organisms adapted to variable pH, creatures that evolved in naturally acidic environments and are now spreading into newly acidified waters. The future ocean won't be lifeless. It will be different, dominated by survivors and invaders rather than the species we've known. This is the pressure cooker effect in its full, terrifying glory. Evolution under extreme duress, adaptation driven by survival at the edge of physiological possibility. Every generation of marine organisms born into this acidifying ocean faces selection for traits their parents didn't need. Every population is being winnowed, sorted, reshaped by chemistry that changes faster than natural selection has ever had to track. And we have no idea what the endpoint looks like because this experiment has never been run before at this speed, at this scale, with this many variables changing simultaneously. Will the ocean stabilize into some new equilibrium, populated by acid-tolerant descendants of today's species? Will cascading extinctions trigger total ecosystem collapse? Or will we witness something more unexpected? Evolutionary innovations emerging from this chemical crucible. Adaptations we can't predict because they've never existed before? The pressure is immense. The clock is running. And in the darkness below, life is being forced to evolve or disappear. The ocean is becoming a laboratory for accelerated evolution, and no one is controlling the experiment. They exist in a realm where sunlight has never reached, where the pressure would crush a human body in seconds, where temperatures hover just above freezing and the darkness is absolute. Deep-sea organisms are evolution's masterwork of extremophile design, creatures so alien in their adaptations that they seem borrowed from science fiction. But something strange is happening in the abyss. The environmental upheaval reshaping shallow waters is sending ripples, chemical, thermal, physical, into the deepest trenches, and the organisms living there are responding in ways that blur the line between adaptation and transformation. These are the new architects, species that have spent millions of years perfecting survival in Earth's harshest environment, and they're now being forced to redesign themselves all over again. What emerges from this process might be the most alien life our planet has ever produced, and we're only beginning to glimpse what it looks like. Consider the genetic revelations that have emerged from studying deep-sea fish. Recent genomic research on species living at depths greater than 3,000 meters has identified a highly conserved convergent mutation in the RTF1 gene, a genetic change that appears independently across multiple lineages, enhancing transcription efficiency to help cells function under crushing pressure. This isn't a single species adapting. It's evolution discovering the same solution repeatedly, carving the same genetic pathway into different branches of the deep-sea family tree. The mutation makes cells work more efficiently when every biological process is being squeezed by pressures hundreds of times greater than at the surface. It's a molecular-level adaptation so fundamental that it's become nearly universal among hadal zone fishes, those living in the planet's deepest trenches. And here's what should unsettle us. This adaptation took millions of years to evolve in stable conditions. What happens when those conditions destabilize? The deep sea has two kinds of colonizers, and their stories reveal evolution operating on vastly different timescales. Ancient survivors are lineages that descended into the abyss before the Cretaceous mass extinction 66 million years ago, species that have been refining their pressure adaptations for geological eons. New immigrants are the majority, organisms whose ancestors lived in shallower waters and invaded the deep sea relatively recently, within the last 60 million years. These new immigrants underwent rapid diversification, evolving specialized traits at accelerated rates to survive in environments their ancestors never experienced. Deep-sea anglerfish, those grotesque luminous predators with males parasitically fused to females, evolved from bottom-dwelling ancestors and exploded into diversity once they entered the open water abyss. They developed larger jaws, smaller eyes, more diverse body shapes, fundamental anatomical redesigns accomplished in evolutionary eye blinks. If new immigrants could adapt this rapidly in the past, what might current environmental pressures unlock? But the truly disturbing adaptations are the ones that involve loss, the systematic deletion of genes that no longer serve a purpose in the lightless deep. Sea anemones living at depths of 4,000 to 6,000 meters have independently lost entire gene families associated with light perception, including the complete circadian clock toolkit. They've deleted the molecular machinery for tracking day and night because in the abyss, these concepts don't exist. Some deep-sea lineages have gone further, losing or pseudogenizing key meiotic genes like myosin, SPO11, and MLH3 genes essential for sexual reproduction. They've abandoned sex itself, shifting toward asexual reproduction as a more energy-efficient strategy in an environment where finding a mate in the darkness might be impossible. This is evolution by subtraction, organisms shedding the biological baggage of their shallow water ancestors and streamlining themselves for a world defined by scarcity, isolation, and crushing pressure. It's adaptation through genetic erosion, and it produces creatures that are less complex in some ways but more perfectly suited to their nightmare environment. Yet alongside this loss comes innovation, specific, targeted genetic changes that enhance performance under deep-sea conditions. Deep-sea anemones exhibit amino acid substitutions that stabilize proteins and maintain enzyme activity at near-freezing temperatures and extreme pressures. Laboratory tests confirm that deep-sea protein variants function better at 4 degrees Celsius than their shallow water counterparts, maintaining activity levels that would collapse in their surface-dwelling relatives. There are selective expansions of gene families related to neural excitability and membrane systems, adaptations that counteract the suppressive effects of pressure on cellular function. The pattern that emerges is what researchers call a loss optimization innovation triad. Delete what you don't need, fine-tune what remains, and innovate new solutions for problems that didn't exist in your ancestral environment. It's a blueprint for surviving the unsurvivable, and it's being written in real time as environmental changes force deep-sea organisms to adapt faster than their evolutionary history would suggest is possible. Now layer climate change on top of these already extreme adaptations. The deep sea isn't isolated from surface processes. It's intimately connected through ocean circulation, temperature gradients, and the steady rain of organic matter sinking from above. As surface waters warm and acidify, those changes propagate downward, altering the chemical and thermal properties of water masses at depth. Oxygen minimum zones are expanding vertically and horizontally, creating vast regions of ocean where dissolved oxygen drops to levels that most organisms cannot tolerate. Deep-sea species evolve to function in cold, stable, oxygen-poor conditions, but even they have limits. When those limits are exceeded, selection intensifies. The organisms with genetic variants that allow slightly better oxygen uptake, slightly more efficient metabolism, slightly greater tolerance for temperature fluctuations, these are the ones that persist. And their offspring inherit not the ocean their parents evolved for, but an ocean in flux, demanding further adaptation with each generation. What might these adaptations look like a century from now? Imagine deep-sea species venturing into shallower waters as oxygen zones contract, bringing anatomies designed for crushing pressure into mid-water realms. Their eyes, vestigial or absent after millions of years in darkness, might begin to re-evolve as natural selection favors individuals with even rudimentary light detection in zones where bioluminescence is the dominant form of communication. Their metabolisms, calibrated for near-freezing temperatures, might shift toward functioning in warmer water as thermal boundaries migrate downward. Bioluminescent organisms could develop more complex light signaling as competition for mates and prey intensifies in shrinking habitable zones. The Hadal trenches, those deepest canyons where pressure reaches over 1,000 atmospheres, might become refuges for species fleeing warming and acidification, driving new waves of deep-sea colonization and rapid adaptation. Each scenario is speculative but grounded in the evolutionary processes we've already observed, processes that accelerate when environmental pressure intensifies. These are the new architects, organisms building themselves from genetic blueprints that are being rewritten even as they're executed. They're not designing new ecosystems by choice. They're being forced into innovation by conditions that are changing faster than evolutionary history prepared them for. And the most unsettling aspect is that we're barely watching it happen. The deep sea remains one of Earth's least explored environments. We've mapped more of the moon's surface than the ocean floor. Most deep-sea species haven't been discovered yet, let alone studied well enough to track their evolutionary responses to environmental change. Somewhere in the trenches, in the abyssal plains, in the mid-water darkness, organisms are evolving traits that have never existed before. They're solving problems that no ancestor ever faced. They're becoming something new, and we won't know what they've become until we finally shine a light into those depths and see what stares back at us. The new architects are working in the dark, and their creations might be more alien than anything evolution has produced in the ocean's entire history. Evolution doesn't happen in isolation, it ripples. When one species transforms, it sends shockwaves through every connection in its ecosystem, every predator that hunts it, every prey it consumes, every competitor vying for the same niche. This is the cascade, the chain reaction that turns individual adaptations into ecosystem-wide upheaval. We've seen organisms evolving rapidly under unprecedented environmental stress, watched them develop new traits to survive acidifying, warming, oxygen-depleted waters. But each of those evolutionary leaps disrupts the delicate equilibrium that took millions of years to establish. Predator-prey relationships, forged over countless generations, suddenly no longer work. Food webs, intricate networks of who eats whom, collapse and reassemble with different players. Symbiotic partnerships dissolve when one partner can no longer survive. And in the chaos of restructuring, something new emerges, ecosystems we've never seen before, dominated by species we didn't predict, functioning according to rules that haven't been written yet. Start with the foundation, the organisms at the base of the marine food web. Pteropods, those tiny swimming snails drifting through open ocean, build delicate shells from calcium carbonate and serve as crucial prey for salmon, whales, seabirds, and countless fish species. But in acidifying water, their shells dissolve faster than they can repair them, and pteropod populations are already showing signs of stress in certain regions. When pteropods decline, everything that eats them faces a food shortage. Salmon growth rates drop. Seabirds struggle to feed their chicks. Whales must search longer for adequate nutrition. The cascade begins not with the dramatic collapse of apex predators, but with the silent erosion of microscopic shell builders that most people have never heard of. Remove a foundation species, and the entire structure built upon it becomes unstable. And the unsettling truth is that we're removing multiple foundation species simultaneously. Not just pteropods, but also foraminifera, coccolithophores, coral larvae, and countless other calcifying organisms that form the invisible scaffolding of ocean ecosystems. Coral reefs provide perhaps the most visceral example of cascade effects already in progress. Corals themselves are ecosystem engineers, organisms that create habitat for thousands of other species. When coral reefs bleach and die under thermal stress and acidification, they don't just disappear. They transform into algae-covered rubble fields that support radically different communities. Studies of natural carbon dioxide seeps, where volcanic activity has been acidifying water for centuries, show us what this transformation looks like. Complex branching corals replaced by massive boulder forms, diverse reef systems giving way to simplified ecosystems dominated by algae, sea urchins, and a handful of acid-tolerant species. Fish diversity plummets. Invertebrate abundance crashes. The three-dimensional structure that provided hiding places for juvenile fish and hunting grounds for predators flattens into barren landscapes. And this isn't a future scenario. It's happening now, with half of all coral coverage lost since the 1950s and projections suggesting reefs will erode faster than they can rebuild by mid-century. But the cascade doesn't stop at habitat loss. It propagates through behavioral changes that disrupt the invisible networks of chemical communication governing marine life. Fish larvae exposed to acidified water lose their ability to detect predators through olfactory cues, swimming obliviously toward danger when they should flee. This isn't a physical deformity. It's a neurological disruption, acidification interfering with the development and function of sensory systems. Prey fish that can't smell predators get eaten more frequently, shifting the balance between predator and prey populations. But it gets stranger. Some fish species also use chemical cues to find suitable habitat, to recognize members of their own species, to navigate back to spawning grounds. When acidification scrambles these signals, fish make catastrophically wrong choices, settling in unsuitable habitat or failing to find mates. The ecological consequences multiply in ways that are nearly impossible to predict because they involve not just mortality, but profound alterations in behavior, navigation, and decision-making. Then there are the opportunists, species that thrive in disrupted ecosystems and expand rapidly into spaces left vacant by less resilient organisms. Jellyfish are already proliferating in warming, overfished, polluted waters, their populations exploding into massive blooms that dominate regions where complex food webs once existed. They tolerate low oxygen better than most fish, they reproduce rapidly, and they have few predators once they reach certain sizes. In acidified waters near natural CO2 seeps, polychaete worms, segmented marine worms, become more abundant, thriving where other species falter. Certain algae and seagrasses may actually benefit from higher carbon dioxide levels, growing faster and more vigorously, potentially outcompeting other primary producers. The cascade creates winners and losers, but the winners are often generalist species, opportunistic organisms that lack the specialization of the species they replace. The result is ecosystems that are simpler, less diverse, less resilient, functional perhaps, but fundamentally impoverished compared to what existed before. Food webs don't just shrink during cascades, they rewire. When key species disappear, their ecological roles get filled by whatever organisms can exploit the newly available resources, and those replacements often behave very differently from the species they replace. Oyster reefs on the east and west coasts of the United States have experienced massive larval die-offs when acidified water prevents shells from forming during the critical first 48 hours of life. Oysters filter enormous quantities of water, removing particles and improving water quality for other organisms. When oyster populations collapse, water quality declines, turbidity increases, and species that depend on clear water suffer secondary impacts. But the vacant ecological niche doesn't remain empty. Other filter feeders, perhaps mussels or tunicates, might expand to fill the role, but they won't provide the same reef structure, the same habitat complexity, the same water filtration rates. The web reconnects, but its topology has changed, and the flow of energy and nutrients through the system follows new pathways that we're only beginning to map. The most terrifying aspect of ecosystem cascades is their potential for threshold effects, tipping points beyond which systems flip into alternative stable states that resist returning to their original configuration. Kelp forests can collapse into urchin barrens when overfishing removes predatory fish and warming stresses kelp. Once established, the urchin barrens persist even if conditions improve because the urchins prevent kelp from recolonizing. Coral reefs can flip to algae-dominated states that resist coral recovery. These alternative states aren't temporary disruptions, they're new equilibria, ecosystems that have settled into configurations fundamentally different from their historical baselines. And here's what should keep us awake at night. We don't know where most ecosystem tipping points are located until we cross them. We don't know how many species a food web can lose before it unravels completely. We don't know which keystone species, if removed, will trigger cascading extinctions. We're conducting a planetary-scale experiment in ecosystem destabilization, and we're discovering the results in real time as systems flip into states they've never occupied before. The cascade is happening right now in every ocean basin across every depth zone, from polar seas to tropical reefs. Food webs are unraveling and rewiring themselves. Predator-prey dynamics are collapsing and rebuilding. Symbiotic relationships are dissolving. Dead zones are becoming breeding grounds for extremophiles. Coral reefs are dying and something else is taking their place. And through it all, evolution continues, selection favoring organisms that can navigate this chaos, that can exploit new opportunities, that can survive in ecosystems that bear little resemblance to the ones their ancestors inhabited. What emerges on the other side won't be the ocean we knew. It will be something stranger, simpler in some ways and more alien in others, an ecosystem assembled from the survivors of the greatest selective bottleneck in human history. The cascade has begun, and it won't stop until every connection in the marine food web has been tested, broken, and rebuilt. The question isn't whether the ocean will stabilize, it's what it will look like when it does, and whether we'll recognize it at all. At the top of the food chain, where intelligence meets instinct and raw power meets sophisticated strategy, the ocean's apex predators reign supreme. Orcas, great white sharks, sperm whales, giant squid. These are evolution's masterpieces, organisms refined over millions of years into the ultimate hunters, the ultimate survivors. But evolution doesn't grant permanent dominance. Every adaptation is conditional, calibrated for the specific environment that shaped it. And when that environment transforms faster than natural selection can track, even apex predators find themselves vulnerable, caught between the world they evolved for and the world that's rapidly replacing it. The question that should haunt us isn't whether these creatures can survive the next century. It's what they might have to become in order to do so, because apex predators don't just adapt to new conditions. They drive evolution throughout entire ecosystems, and their transformations will reshape everything below them in the food web. Consider orcas, those superpredators with brains second only to humans in complexity, with cultures and dialects and hunting strategies passed down through generations. They're already facing cascading disruptions. Salmon populations crashing as rivers warm and acidification disrupts prey availability, marine mammal distributions shifting as ice patterns change, toxic algal blooms increasing in warming waters and concentrating in the fatty tissues of their prey. Orcas rely on echolocation to hunt in dark or murky water, producing clicks and listening for echoes to map their underwater world with stunning precision. But acidification changes how sound propagates through seawater, potentially making echolocation less effective or forcing orcas to adjust click frequencies to maintain hunting efficiency. Selection would favor individuals whose auditory systems can adapt to altered acoustic properties, whose brains can reprocess degraded echolocation data, whose social groups can develop new hunting strategies when traditional ones fail. In a century, we might be looking at orcas with enhanced or modified echolocation capabilities, neurological adaptations for processing sound in chemically altered water, behavioral innovations we can't predict because they'll emerge from social learning accelerated by environmental pressure. Sharks, those ancient architects of marine ecosystems that have survived 5 mass extinctions, face their own evolutionary crucible. Many shark species rely on the ampullae of Lorenzini, electroreceptors that detect the faint electrical fields generated by muscle contractions in prey animals. These organs allow sharks to hunt in complete darkness, to sense prey buried in sediment, to navigate using Earth's magnetic field. But research suggests that ocean acidification and changing water chemistry might affect how these electroreceptors function, potentially requiring sharks to evolve more sensitive organs or alternative sensory systems. Warming waters are already pushing some shark species into new territories, expanding their ranges poleward as tropical and subtropical zones become too warm. The great white sharks cruising California coasts might, in a century, be hunting in Alaskan waters, their metabolisms adjusted for colder temperatures, their prey preferences shifted to whatever species have moved north alongside them. And in expanding dead zones where oxygen levels plummet, we might see sharks evolving enhanced oxygen extraction capabilities, larger gills, more efficient blood chemistry, adaptations that would allow them to hunt in waters that currently represent barriers to their distribution. Deep-sea predators face perhaps the strangest evolutionary pressures because they're already operating at the absolute limits of vertebrate physiology. Giant squid and colossal squid, those legendary deep-sea hunters with eyes the size of dinner plates and tentacles lined with rotating hooks, live in a realm where oxygen is scarce and pressure is crushing. As oxygen minimum zones expand vertically and horizontally, these zones of hypoxia might actually become refuges for species that evolve to function with minimal oxygen, potentially allowing deep-sea squid to expand their ranges into mid-water depths that were previously too oxygen-rich. Ironically, the deoxygenation that devastates most organisms could create new territory for extremophiles. And there's the cognitive question. Cephalopods already possess remarkable problem-solving abilities, complex nervous systems, sophisticated camouflage controlled by millions of chromatophores. Octopuses can open jars, navigate mazes, recognize individual humans. Squid coordinate hunting in groups, communicate through color patterns, display behaviors suggesting far greater intelligence than we once assumed. If environmental pressure intensifies competition, if prey becomes scarcer and harder to catch, if survival requires ever more sophisticated decision-making, could we see accelerated cognitive evolution in cephalopods? Could the next century produce squid that are measurably smarter, more behaviorally flexible, capable of innovations their ancestors never achieved? Marine mammals face a unique challenge because their intelligence is already extraordinary, and intelligence creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities during rapid environmental change. Sperm whales, which dive to depths exceeding 2,000 meters to hunt giant squid in the darkness, possess the largest brains of any animal on Earth. They communicate through complex patterns of clicks called codas, different whale clans using different dialects, possibly different naming systems for individual whales. Recent research suggests sperm whale communication might be even more sophisticated than we realized, with potential for combinatorial structure analogous to phonetics in human language. When their prey distributions shift, when deep-sea ecosystems restructure, when acoustic properties of seawater change, sperm whales will need to adapt not just physiologically but cognitively, learning new hunting grounds, developing new communication patterns, passing new knowledge through their matrilineal social groups. The adaptations might be primarily cultural rather than genetic in the short term, but over a century selection would favor whales whose brains are most capable of this kind of rapid learning and innovation. We might be looking at the early stages of accelerated cognitive evolution in a species that already possesses one of the most complex brains nature has ever produced. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is what happens when apex predators encounter entirely novel prey, organisms that have evolved so rapidly in response to environmental pressure that their behavior, their chemistry, their very nature has become alien. Imagine orcas hunting fish populations that have undergone rapid evolutionary changes in stress response, making them less predictable, harder to herd using traditional techniques. Imagine sharks tracking prey that have evolved altered electrical signatures as an inadvertent consequence of metabolic adaptations to low oxygen. Imagine squid confronting bioluminescent organisms that have developed more complex light-based communication, creating visual clutter that interferes with hunting. Every time a prey species evolves a novel trait, predators face selection pressure to evolve countermeasures. And this predator-prey arms race accelerates when environmental disruption is driving rapid evolution across entire ecosystems. The apex predators of a century from now won't just look different. They'll be hunting different prey in different ways in ecosystems that function according to rules that don't exist yet. And there's a darker possibility we need to confront. Some apex predators might not adapt fast enough. Evolution requires genetic variation, time, population sizes large enough to produce adaptive mutations. Many apex predator species have small populations, long generation times, low reproductive rates, characteristics that make them vulnerable during rapid environmental change. If salmon populations collapse before orcas can adapt to alternative prey, if shark nursery habitats disappear before juveniles can develop in new locations, if squid prey bases shift into depth zones beyond the physiological reach of their predators, we could see apex predator extinctions or severe population crashes. And when you remove apex predators from ecosystems, the consequences cascade downward in ways that are often catastrophic. Prey populations explode without predation pressure, overconsuming their own food sources and triggering trophic cascades that restructure entire food webs. Middle predators increase in abundance, intensifying pressure on smaller prey species. Ecosystems lose their top-down regulation and can flip into alternative stable states dominated by very different species assemblages. The absence of apex predators isn't just a loss of individual species, it's a fundamental restructuring of how ecosystems function. In a century, when you look at the ocean's apex predators, if they still exist, you might be looking at something that no longer operates according to the ecological rules we learned from studying their ancestors. Orcas with enhanced echolocation hunting in acidified waters. Sharks with modified sensory systems tracking prey in deoxygenated zones. Deep-sea squid expanding into mid-water depths that were previously uninhabitable. Sperm whales whose communication has evolved to coordinate hunting in restructured deep-sea ecosystems. Or perhaps vacant ecological niches where apex predators once reigned, replaced by opportunistic species that weren't predators before, but are now filling roles left empty by extinction. This is the apex question. What happens to the ocean's thinking, hunting, strategizing creatures when the world they evolved to dominate becomes a world they're struggling to survive in? Do they adapt fast enough to remain at the top? Do they evolve into something recognizably different but still apex? Or do they fade away, leaving the ocean's highest trophic levels populated by whatever organisms can scramble up the food web fast enough to exploit the vacancy? We won't know until we look back from the other side of this century and see what's still there, what's vanished, and what new apex predators, if any, have emerged from evolution's crucible. The ocean's kings and queens are being tested, and the throne might not survive intact. We stand at the edge of something unprecedented in human history, the ability to watch evolution happen in real time, to witness the ocean transforming not over millions of years but within a single human lifetime. We are not passive observers in this story, we are the architects of the pressure, the authors of the environmental chaos forcing marine life to adapt or vanish. Every ton of carbon dioxide we pump into the atmosphere dissolves into seawater. Every degree of warming propagates through ocean currents. Every dead zone expands because of nutrients we've dumped into coastal waters. We've become the dominant evolutionary force on this planet, reshaping natural selection itself through our collective actions. And yet, paradoxically, we're also witnesses to something that should fill us with awe despite the horror. Life's relentless creativity, its stubborn refusal to surrender, its capacity to find solutions to problems that shouldn't have solutions. The next century will determine not just which species survive, but what kind of ocean emerges from this crucible, and whether we're prepared to meet what we've created. The tragedy is undeniable and immense. Half of all coral reefs have already vanished since the 1950s, skeletal monuments to ecosystems that took millennia to build and decades to destroy. Oyster larvae on both coasts of the United States are dying en masse because acidified water dissolves their shells faster than they can form them in their first 48 hours of life, collapsing fisheries and threatening food security for coastal communities. Pteropods, those tiny swimming snails that form a crucial link in marine food webs, are showing signs of shell dissolution in regions where acidification is most advanced, and their decline threatens everything that depends on them, from salmon to whales to seabirds. Meta-analyses across hundreds of species reveal survival rates dropping by 27%, calcification plummeting by similar margins, growth and development slowing across virtually all marine life when subjected to acidified conditions. These aren't projections for a distant future. They're measurements of changes happening right now, documented losses that represent real organisms struggling and failing to exist in water that has become chemically hostile within the span of a few human generations. But alongside the losses, there are survivors, and their existence is both hope and warning. Certain coral populations are showing enhanced tolerance to heat and acidification, genetic variants that were once neutral or slightly disadvantageous suddenly becoming life-saving adaptations. Some sea urchin larvae develop normally even in highly acidified water, suggesting rapid selection for acid-resistant genotypes within populations. Studies of natural carbon dioxide seeps, places where volcanic activity has acidified water for centuries, reveal ecosystems that persist despite conditions we consider catastrophic, simplified, yes, and dominated by different species but functional nonetheless. Polychaete worms thrive where other organisms struggle. Certain algae and seagrasses grow faster in high carbon dioxide conditions. Boulder corals replace branching forms. The future ocean won't be empty. It will be different, populated by the descendants of organisms that possess just enough genetic variation, just enough physiological flexibility, just enough behavioral adaptability to navigate conditions their ancestors never faced. The question isn't whether life will survive, life always survives, but what that life will look like and whether it will support the diversity and complexity we've come to depend on. What makes this moment unique in Earth's history is the speed of change combined with the scale of human observation. Previous mass extinctions happened without witnesses, their stories reconstructed from fossils and geochemical signatures millions of years after the fact. But we're living through this one, documenting it in real time with technologies that allow us to track individual species' responses, to sequence genomes and identify the specific genes under selection, to monitor ecosystem transformations as they unfold. We're watching Swedish sea snails evolve new shell shapes in 3 years. We're documenting Baltic flounders splitting into reproductively isolated species in 7,000 years, evolutionary eye blinks. We're measuring the rapid adaptation of fish populations to warming waters, the emergence of acid tolerance in marine invertebrates, the behavioral changes in predators whose prey distributions have shifted. This is evolution moving fast enough to observe, natural selection operating on timescales we can measure within scientific careers rather than across geological epochs. And that speed is both fascinating and terrifying because it tells us how intense the environmental pressure has become. Yet we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. For all our scientific sophistication, for all our monitoring and modeling and genomic analysis, We have almost no ability to predict what specific evolutionary innovations will emerge from this pressure cooker. Evolution is not deterministic. It works with whatever genetic variation happens to exist in populations, producing solutions that are often surprising, sometimes bizarre, occasionally brilliant in their unexpectedness. We can identify general trends, predict which traits might be favored, forecast which species face the highest extinction risk. But we cannot know what specific adaptations will arise, what unexpected genetic variants will prove advantageous, what behavioral innovations will emerge from organisms forced to solve novel problems. The deep sea remains largely unexplored. We've mapped more of the moon's surface than the ocean floor. Most marine species haven't been discovered yet, let alone studied well enough to understand their evolutionary potential. Somewhere in the trenches, in the abyssal plains, in the midwater darkness, organisms are evolving right now, and we won't know what they've become until we finally look. And there's another dimension to this story that we're only beginning to appreciate: the possibility of cognitive evolution, of intelligence itself being shaped by environmental pressure. Orcas, dolphins, sperm whales. These are organisms with extraordinarily complex brains, sophisticated social structures, cultural transmission of knowledge. When their environments destabilize, when traditional hunting grounds disappear and prey distributions shift and acoustic properties of seawater change, these species must adapt not just physiologically but cognitively. They must learn new behaviors, develop new strategies, pass new knowledge through their social groups. Over a century, selection would favor individuals whose brains are most capable of this kind of rapid learning and behavioral flexibility. We might be witnessing the early stages of accelerated cognitive evolution in marine mammals, perhaps even in cephalopods, octopuses, and squid that already display remarkable problem-solving abilities and might, under intense selection pressure, evolve even greater intelligence. The thought is both wondrous and deeply humbling. We're reshaping not just the bodies of marine organisms but potentially their minds, their capacity to think and problem-solve and navigate complexity. What should we do with this knowledge? The science is clear: reducing carbon emissions, protecting marine habitats, establishing refuges where organisms can potentially adapt without additional stressors, supporting restoration efforts for critical ecosystems like coral reefs and oyster beds. But beyond the policy prescriptions and management strategies, there's a philosophical reckoning we need to have with what we're doing and what we're witnessing. We've triggered rapid evolution across an entire planet's worth of ocean ecosystems. We've become, unintentionally and largely unwittingly, the dominant force shaping natural selection in the marine realm. And the organisms responding to that pressure, the survivors, the adapters, the evolutionary innovators, are producing an ocean we've never seen before, ecosystems that function according to rules we're still trying to understand. We can't undo the changes we've set in motion. Ocean acidification will continue for decades even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow because of the carbon already dissolved in seawater. But we can choose how we respond, with wonder at life's resilience, with humility about our limitations, with determination to document and understand what's happening, and with commitment to reducing the pressures we're imposing. In the next century, when you look at the ocean, if we're fortunate enough to still have diverse, functional marine ecosystems, you'll be looking at evolution's latest chapter, written under the most extreme selective pressure in millions of years. You might see descendants of today's species bearing traits their ancestors never possessed, adaptations cobbled together from genetic variants that were useless in the old ocean but essential in the new one. You might see novel species that diverged so rapidly they're no longer recognizable as relatives of their recent ancestors. You might see ecosystems structured in ways that bear little resemblance to historical baselines, food webs rewired by extinctions and invasions and evolutionary innovations we didn't predict. Or you might see something we can't yet imagine because evolution operates outside the boundaries of human expectation, producing solutions we never would have designed, organisms we never knew could exist. This is the great evolutionary experiment of the Anthropocene, and we're both the ones conducting it and the ones whose future depends on its outcome. Evolution is happening now, faster than it should, driven by pressures we created. The only certainty is that the ocean emerging from this crucible will be unlike any ocean that has existed before, and we'll have to live with what we've made or what has made itself in response to us.